everyone, and welcome to a new book video. Today I'm excited to share 25 books that I wish I could read for the first time again. Obviously, these are some of my very favourite books of all time, but they're not just favourite books. They're also books that often have a great twist to the plot, or there's some reason that I wish that I could be introduced to these books for the first time all over again, because my first time of reading these books generally provided an experience that really stuck with me, was really memorable, and maybe even in some way changed me or changed my life a little bit. So with that in mind, let's start with some children's books that really were life-changing for me and that I wish I could just come to again for the very first time and recapture that experience of reading them in my childhood. The first one is Ballet Shoes by Noel Streatfeild. This is one of the most pivotal, life-changing reads for me. I came to it very young and I absolutely fell in love with this story of three children who are not related but were each adopted and so grew up as sisters together. And they grew up with an ambition to, and I quote, put their names into history books. They wanted to do something special with their lives. One of them becomes a ballerina, the other becomes an actress, and the third becomes a pilot and is sort of amazing generally at mechanics and engineering. And this book really impacted me as a child. For one thing, it prompted my own love of ballet. And I had many ballet lessons growing up, wanted to be a ballerina. But more fundamentally than that, it showed me three girls who thought of their lives beyond just getting married. And that is really something that stayed with me forever, and I think changed the course of my life, because it showed me three examples of young girls who became women, who what was in their heads, what really mattered to them was having some kind of fulfilling career and living out a dream that really meant something to them. So this story changed my life in that way, because even growing up many years later than the children in this book did, still amongst my peers, I was really unusual in not thinking primarily about my wedding, who I was going to marry as a teenager and so on. I was much more preoccupied with what I wanted to do with my life, and that I wanted my life to be creative and fulfilling. And I really put that feeling down to having read this book at a young age. I've read this book so many times since I first read it, but I would love to recapture the magic of coming to this story for the first time as a child and just falling in love with every page. So yes, very special book to me. Another hugely influential book in my childhood is Anne of Green Gables by Ellen Montgomery. And I wish I could return to this book for the first time all over again, because it's just the most magical read. And I just fell in love with Anne, but I also fell in love with Ellen Montgomery's amazingly lyrical writing as a child. I really credit this book for igniting my own love for nature, for the countryside, for appreciating the beauty of the natural world, and for how having that kind of appreciation and also having a remarkable imagination can be a real gift to your life and help to make you happier, however hard your circumstances. That's a lesson that really I learnt young from reading Anne of Green Gables, and it's something that has stayed with me. But I wish that I could just recapture the magic of reading this book for the first time. It really meant so much to me as a child, and it's one I've obviously returned to many times since. But I think anyone is really lucky who picks up Anne of Green Gables for the very first time. And then another hugely influential book from my childhood is The School at the Chalet by Eleanor M. Brent Dyer. This is actually a first edition of the book that I have, and it's very special to me. It was first published in 1925, so 100 years ago. And actually, the independent publisher Girls Gone By Publishers are bringing out a paperback copy of The School at the Chalet this year. You can pre-order it now, and it's in celebration of its 100th anniversary. So this is an old book, but reading it as a 9-year-old, it mattered so much to me, and I immediately just fell in love with the world of the Chalet School. It's about an English school, an English boarding school that's set up in Austria. I had spent some of my earliest years of my childhood growing up on the French-Swiss border. So the sort of mountainous landscape and beautiful lakes described in this book reminded me of Switzerland, and also the ethos behind the Chalet School as being an international school and really celebrating the importance of bringing international pupils together, learning from each other, celebrating different languages and cultures. All of that is in this book. And that was always something that really mattered to me from my experience of going to an international school and being sort of brought up internationally, moving around a lot as a child as well. So for that reason, I just fell in love with this book from the beginning, but I also knew it was part of a series. There are 58 titles in this series, and it was so exciting to discover a brand new series as a child. And it would be fun for me to be able to sort of travel back in time and recapture those moments when I first discovered the Chalet School books. I knew I had all these other books that I could read in the series, and I just fell in love with the world and with the characters, and it really impacted my life, because that was really when I started collecting vintage children's books. My love of vintage books has sort of remained with me since then. I also joined literary societies like the Friends of the Chalet School Society and the New Chalet Club and things like that. From a very young age, I started writing to pen pals who were also members of these societies. And from then I progressed to joining a lot of other literary societies like the Jane Austen Society, the P.G. Wodehouse Society. So in many ways I can mark my love of vintage books, of the interwar years from first reading the Chalet School books, but it also started my love of connecting with others through a shared joy of literature. So this book really impacted me, and I would love the chance to go back in time, read it again for the first time. Before I tell you about the next book, I wanted to share my offer code for serious readers. I'm really delighted that serious readers are very kindly sponsoring today's video. As you probably already know, I'm a huge fan of serious readers. They make the best reading lights, and I use my high definition floor light all the time, so I'm very pleased to have an offer code to share with you. My offer code is Miranda, all capital letters Miranda, and if you use that offer code, you'll get £150 off any of the high definition lights by serious readers, as well as free shipping within the UK. So although the free shipping only extends to UK residents, the rest of the offer, the £150 off any of the high definition lights, extends internationally. So I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of that. I use my Sirius light all year round, whether it's winter or summer. Being a booktuber and a writer, I read for both pleasure and for work, so having a really good reading light matters a lot to me. And I've had this reading light for well over 2 years now, must be coming up to 3 years that I've had this, and it's made such a fantastic difference to my reading life. I especially love to read in the evenings and in bed just before going to sleep. So I really value having a good reading light. I also read a lot of vintage books, and the print in those books can be really very small and faded. But I find that reading with my serious light makes all the difference. And one of the things that I love best about my serious light is the incredible light quality. The high-definition lights by Sirius readers feature something called daylight wavelength technology, and this essentially replicates the daylight spectrum as closely as technically possible. So when I'm reading with my Sirius light, I feel like I'm reading in natural light, or at least as close to natural light as it's possible to get. I also love that I can adjust the width of the beam of the light as well as the brightness levels of the light, so I get just the right amount of light for me, and I don't worry about overstraining my eyes when I'm reading, which is great news for me because I have truly terrible eyesight and I don't want it getting any worse. Anyway, if you also could do with having a great reading light in your life, then do take advantage of my offer code. Again, that is Miranda, all capital letters Miranda. And if you use that offer code, you'll get £150 off any of the high definition lights by Sirius readers, as well as free shipping within the UK. I'll put all the details of my offer code and the relevant link in the video description box just down below. So be sure you check out all the information there. But now let's get back to my video. Now, another author that I came to adore a bit later in my childhood is Eva Ibbotson. I still love her books. The Morning Gift is one of my absolute favourites of hers, and I would love to read this book again for the very first time. Eva Ibbotson is a marvellous writer. I recommend all of her books, but I would recommend starting with The Morning Gift. It's one of my favourites. I also loved her book, The Secret of Platform 13, as a child, and that's one I wish I could return to as well. But I loved reading these as a young adult myself, and definitely this is a story that has sort of remained with me, and it's one that I wish I could experience again for the first time. Definitely a huge favourite of mine. In terms of contemporary literature, probably my favourite genre to read is historical fiction. So here I have a few books that I discovered probably, I would say, in the past 15 years, these, and they're the ones that have really sort of remained with me. One that I would love to read for the first time again is Gillespie and I by Jane Harris. This is such a brilliant historical fiction book. I love it because I feel Jane Harris really captures the tone of the period very well, and this is set in the Victorian era. Why I would love especially to come to this book fresh once again though is because there's an incredible twist to the plot. So I always remember that, and of course when you reread a book like that, you know what's coming, so that impact isn't the same as the very first time that you read the story. But I remember just loving the twist. It really blew me away, and this is a book that I think is brilliant. One of my favourites from the past couple of decades or so, for sure. And then another historical fiction book that I read, I think almost 10 years ago now, coming up to 10 years, but it's one that's just really stayed with me ever since I first read it, and I would love to come to it fresh once again, is Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. This has actually been made into a TV series as well, but I highly recommend reading the book if you haven't read it. It really opened my eyes to a period of history and a subject matter that I hadn't really known much about. I hadn't known a lot about Korean, Japanese history, and this is a type of family saga that's done really well, sort of bringing you through generations of a family. And it was just so beautifully written, and it's definitely a book that I would like to come to afresh once more, because I just remember getting so swept up in the story, wanting to find out what was going to happen to all of the characters, and just being really swept along, and so enjoying the read. So although this is a book that would also be wonderful to return to again, just experiencing it for the first time was really special. So another one that I'd like to come to afresh once more. And then another historical fiction book that I've loved from, I don't know, the past couple of decades is the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society. Again, this was made into a film, but if you've never read the book, I really recommend reading the book. I fell in love with this story, and it's one that I would just love to experience afresh, a bit like Pachinko. I just remember being swept along by this story and really wanting to find out what was happening to the characters. And it just is one that I would like to experience again, in that way, because I remember just enjoying it so much. It's also written in letter format, which is a lot more unusual, I think, for books generally published nowadays, but it was done so well. And again, I just felt captured the sort of language and spirit of the times really well. It's set sort of just after World War II, but also part of the story takes place during World War II. And again, it was about an aspect of the history of the war that I didn't know so much about, the history of the Channel Islands during the war. So it sort of opened my eyes to that part of history that I didn't know so much about. So I just remember being really impacted by this book as well. And then speaking of World War II, this is one of my absolute favourite historical fiction books, again from the past sort of 15, 20 years. That's Codename Verity by Elizabeth Vine. I don't know if you say Vine or Wine, I can't remember. But this is such an amazing book. It's classed as a YA read, but honestly, it really is an adult book, I think. It's just so exquisitely written. The story is amazing. This is one, again, that has a real plot twist. So for that reason, I would love to experience this book again. But like the other historical fiction ones I've mentioned, it also just really pulls you in. I remember just being desperate to find out what was going to happen to these characters, just getting really emotionally invested in all of these books. And I think that especially happens the very first time you read a book. You just get that huge emotional investment because you don't know what's coming next. And you really want to keep turning the pages. So all of these historical fiction books I've recommended, I think, have that pull to them that really keep you invested and engaged. And they make amazing first-time reads for that reason. So although I would love to reread, I have reread these books, there is just a magic about reading them for the first time. And yeah, this is one I would love to be able to read for the first time again. If you haven't read it before, then I think you're in for a treat. Let's turn now to some mysteries, because obviously mysteries are wonderful books to read for the very first time, because much as I actually adore rereading Agatha Christie, and I do all the time, there's nothing like the very first time you encounter a great mystery. And I'm actually going to start with Sherlock Holmes, because I adored all of the Sherlock Holmes books. As a child, I read every single short story. I read all of the novellas. I loved the Jeremy Brett TV series. I loved the BBC dramatizations. I was just a huge Sherlock Holmes fan. And I would love to recapture that enjoyment of coming to the stories for the very first time, because I've known these books now for so long that obviously my experience is not like that. But I would love to recapture coming to them for the first time. I've just picked up one of my volumes here, which is actually The Return of Sherlock Holmes and His Last Spell. So these have the latest stories in them, but some of my favourites are actually in this collection. And yes, it would just be so much fun to be introduced to Holmes and Watson for the very first time. Such great, such iconic characters, and capturing meeting them for the first time is just amazing. I would love to be able to capture that and come to these stories afresh once more. But Agatha Christie, I mean, I also read every Agatha Christie book through my teens. I just adored them. I remember being absolutely blown away by so many of them. Death on the Nile is one I'll always remember. A Murder is Announced, An Appointment with Death. I mean, I could go on and on, but I've sort of selected two that I would really love to be able to come to afresh, not knowing the ending once more. And one of them is the very first Miss Marple, The Murder at the Vicarage by Agatha Christie. I love this one because Miss Marple is my favourite detective. Out of Poirot and Miss Marple, I will always be a Miss Marple girl, although I do love Poirot as well. But Miss Marple's my favourite. And the very first book that features Miss Marple is amazing. It is such a good mystery. Brilliant twist to the plot. I remember being really surprised the first time that I read this. So I would love to be able to come to this book fresh once more. And then a Poirot book that I'd love to be able to come to fresh again is The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie. Because she just does something very original with this story. And Agatha Christie is so well known now. Even if you haven't read all her books, then you maybe have heard about a lot of them and things might get a bit spoiled. But if you could kind of come to her really fresh with not knowing anything about her, not having read a lot of her other mysteries, so not kind of knowing how to predict what she might do, then I think that would just be magical to be able to do that. And I was lucky enough coming to her books so young that they really were fresh for me. So I would love to experience The Murder of Roger Ackroyd in that way and just be really surprised by it, by reading it for the first time. So there are so many Agatha Christies, though, that I'd love to experience for the first time. Then another author I had to mention was Georgette Heyer. She was my sort of favourite romance writer. It's funny because for the first time, I've read a bit more like modern romance. And I realise I'm sort of really out of it when it comes to modern romance and sort of what they call spicy books, which are really not my thing. And most of the time I just think I'd much rather be reading a Georgette Heyer, and I would love to experience Georgette Heyer for the first time again. These are not spicy romances, but they're really witty, really funny, just really charming stories. And if you like Jane Austen, you have to give Georgette Heyer a go. I mean, she's definitely her own writer. And there's more romance to her books than there is to Jane Austen, but they're just really fun. They got me through a lot of exam periods when I was like late teens, early 20s. I remember reading so many Georgette Heyers when my mind was so full of studying, and a way to sort of try and switch off and calm down at night before going to sleep was reading Georgette Heyer. And I would love to experience her characters again for the first time. Venetia is one of my favourites. And then speaking of light-hearted books, P.G. Wodehouse is another author I would love to experience for the first time once more. I've reread these books so many times. I adore all of his series, especially Blandings Castle, Jeeves and Wooster. I love his short stories though as well, like the Mr. Mulliner short stories. Jeeves and Wooster though, I think will always be my favourite. And one of my favourite of the Jeeves and Wooster stories is Right Ho Jeeves. I remember the first time I read this, I just laughed and laughed and laughed so hard. And I would love to come to some of his lines fresh once again, because they're just so funny, and experiencing them for the first time, you just can't take that away. It's just priceless. So I love this book. And in a way, P.G. Wodehouse books are a bit like a mystery to me, because they're so intricately plotted. And Bertie Wooster gets himself into such terrible scrapes that you get to the point always at some point in one of the books where you think, how is he going to get out of this one? What miracle can Jeeves perform to get him out of this terrible situation? So it's almost like a mystery in that you don't quite know how everything's going to come right in the end, but it always does. The plot is always incredible. And there is always this problem to be solved in the books of how to get Bertie out of a scrape. So I think that they're just amazing. And the first time that you read these is very, very special. So I'd love to recapture that feeling. Another book I adore is All Creatures Great and Small by James Herriot. This is, of course, the first in a series of books. I love them all. And again, even though they're such different subject matter, they remind me a bit of P.G. Wodehouse in that they're so funny. They're also very well plotted, and you just come to love the characters who are based, of course, on real life characters in these books so much. Some of the stories, some of the sort of encounters and episodes that James Herriot writes about in these are just so funny the first time you read about them. Just hilarious. And of course they make me laugh every time that I reread these books, but there's nothing like the first time. So coming to these books fresh, it's just really special. There's so much to make you laugh. There are moments that make you cry as well, but they're just fantastic. And being introduced to James and to Tristan and Siegfried for the first time, I mean, it's just brilliant. So yes, I wish I could experience these books for the first time all over again. Now, I'm sure you knew I wasn't going to do a video like this without mentioning a Jane Austen book. And really, of course, I want to mention all of her books, because how special would that be to be able to come fresh to Jane Austen once more? I have read every book of hers so many times. It's kind of hard for me to imagine coming to them without knowing the story by this point in my life. And I would definitely choose all of them to be able to experience for the first time again. But I was strict with myself, and I only chose one, and I chose Emma, because it's been said about this book that it's almost like a sort of early mystery or detective story in some ways, and there are some plot twists to this book that make it a bit more like a mystery you have to work out, or that once you finish the book, you kind of want to go back to the beginning to see the hints that Jane Austen drops all through it. And so for that reason, that's why I've chosen this one to experience fresh once more, because there is a real plot twist to this story that in some ways is hard to see coming, and it's just so cleverly done. That's the reason I've chosen Emma to be able to experience for the very first time again. Another classic I'd love to experience for the very first time again is Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. I love Barchester Chronicles by him, which starts with the Warden, and I do recommend that book if you're new to the series. But one of my absolute favourites from the series is Barchester Towers. It's got some of the funniest proposal scenes in this story. I mean, if you love the Mr. Collins proposal scene from Pride and Prejudice, then you have to give Barchester Towers a try as well, because there are just such funny incidents in that book. and some very, very funny proposal scenes that sort of rival the Mr. Collins proposal scene. And I would just love to experience this book again for the first time, because I just remember loving being immersed in the world that Trollope creates in his characters, and it would be very special to come to that afresh again. So another one that I highly recommend. Then some more modern classics. This is a Persephone classic, Little Boy Lost by Margarita Lasky. I've spoken about how much I love this book many times before. I quite recently reread it again and just loved it. But this book is one of those books that has a really memorable ending, an ending that just really impacts you and always stays with you, or at least it always stayed with me. And for that reason, I would love to be able to read this book for the first time all over again. It's set just after World War II. It's about a man who has lost both his wife and his son during the war. And his wife died in France and his son went missing. And he presumes his son also died, but after the war, he decides that he needs to search for his son, and there's just a chance that his son has been discovered alive, living in a convent in France, and he decides to go and try to find out if this really is his son or if it isn't, and whether or not, in the end, it actually matters. It's just such a moving story, a beautiful read. And if you haven't read it before, then you really are in for a treat. And that ending, it will definitely stay with you. The Shell Seekers by Rosamund Pilcher is another book that I wish I could experience for the first time all over again. Because I remember the first time I read this, it was another example of a book where I could just get entirely engrossed in the world of the story, and I knew I was in the hands of a very good storyteller, and just loving that sensation, and also loving the discovery of a new to me author, because I think this was the first Rosamund Pilcher book I ever read. And that was really exciting to me because I knew that I'd found a writer I just loved, and that after finishing this, I would want to go on and read her other books as well. And I would love to recapture that sensation. I think that's such a lovely sensation when not only do you discover a new favourite book, but you also discover a new favourite author, and you've got that excitement ahead of you of reading the rest of their canon. And that's just a marvellous feeling, and I wish I could go back and feel that again coming to Rosamund Pilcher for the first time. I could say the same of Elizabeth von Arnim and The Enchanted April. I was really young when I read this book for the first time, and I can't really remember my first impressions apart from having just loved it. And I would love to be able to recapture that now, read this for the first time, and know again that I'd found a new favourite author of mine as well as a new favourite book. Another book I want to talk about is O Caledonia by Elspeth Barker. And this is a real sort of modern classic. It was published in the 90s, but it's set, I think, more like just fairly soon after World War II, that kind of time. And I've chosen this one partly because the book begins with you knowing that the heroine, a 16-year-old girl called Janet, has just been murdered. So you know that from the very first page. By the end of the book, you know who's killed her. So any sort of reread of the book is a different experience because you know what has happened to Janet. And for that reason, I would love to be able to return to this book for the very first time, because it just is a different reading experience when you come back to it for further readings. Now, this is a book that you can get a lot from with return readings as well, with rereadings, but it's hard to just capture the magic of that very first read with this book, and it would be a really good one to experience for the first time again. This is such a quirky story. I think when I first read this book, it was one of the sort of first examples I really came across of a book that blended all these different genres and brought a really sort of quirky aspect to telling a story that in some ways I thought I was familiar with, a sort of coming of age story set in quite a gothic setting, a sort of crumbling castle in Scotland. It had elements of I Capture the Castle to the story, but then it also brought in this murder mystery element a bit. There's this real sense of the gothic that's a bit like Jane Eyre that comes into it too. Some people have said, which I agree with, it's a mix of the Bronte sisters, Edgar Allan Poe, Dodie Smith, who wrote I Capture the Castle, and Edward Gorey. And yes, it sort of almost has all of those elements in it. So reading it for the first time was just quite an experience, because I'd never read anything really quite like this book before, and it would just be great to recapture that. There's also some beautiful nature writing in this too, that I would love to read again for the first time as well. But yes, O Caledonia is definitely one that I would recommend reading. And another sort of gothic but extremely good classic is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This one and My Cousin Rachel by Daphne du Maurier are two books I would just love to encounter for the first time again. This one, well, they both actually have a real twist to the ending, and that's why especially I would like to read these books again for the first time. But I remember being kind of blown away by the twist to Rebecca when I very first read it. I was, again, really very young, reading Rebecca, and I thought I could see how the story was going to go. You know, there's a part in the book where you think you know what is going to be revealed, but it ends up being something quite different, at least from what I was expecting. And yes, so there are a couple plot twists at the end of the book, and they just change your whole sort of understanding of the book up until that point. And for that reason, I would just love to be able to encounter this again. And if you've never read Rebecca, then you must read it. Such a classic, such amazing twists to it. So really recommend it. And then finally, I wanted to share some poetry books, because I think people talk a lot about books that change their life, books that they wish they could encounter for the first time again. But some poems and poetry are really vital to my reading life, to how I became a reader. There are poems that have just stayed with me ever since I first read them as a child or a teenager, and they're so incredible, and they're poems I would love to experience for the first time. Because there's something magical about reading a truly extraordinary poem for the first time. And I think poetry can be as life-changing as books are, but I don't think people talk about that quite as much. So I really wanted to bring a couple of poetry anthologies into this video. And one of them is New and Selected Poems Volume 1 by Mary Oliver. I adore Mary Oliver's poetry. I mean, she's a writer I really credit with igniting a lot of my love for the natural world, for nature writing, but for nature poetry as well. Two of my favourites are in here. Wild Geese is one of my absolute favourite poems of all time, and that's in here. But to be honest, there are just so many of her poems that I love that are in this anthology, which is why I wanted to single this one out. And it's just a very special book to me, and her poems have been really impactful in my life, so I had to mention this one. And then Maya Angelou's poetry, and this is a wonderful anthology of her poetry, and Still I Rise. And her memoir, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, is also one of the books I wish I could come back to for the first time again. But for me, it really is Maya Angelou's poetry that was just so extraordinary. The first time that I read Phenomenal Woman, for instance, and Still I Rise, both those poems are in here, but so many of her other poems too, just so impactful, so incredible, and I would love to be able to experience reading them for the very first time again. And then another poet that's mattered a lot to me is Edward Thomas. I love his poetry. I'll always remember my mum sort of teaching Adlestrop to me, us sort of reading it together and her helping me to understand it when I was little. And that's a memory that remains with me. I love so much of his nature poetry. I also really adore his nature writing too, which maybe isn't quite as well known as his poetry. And I wanted to share this beautiful edition of one of his books, The Heart of England, which has a marvelous collection of essays in here and just the most lyrical nature writing. Quite a lot of Edward Thomas quotes have ended up in my book, The Country Commonplace book, because they're just so beautiful. His writing is amazing, his poetry as well. But I would love to be able to experience some of the essays in particular in here for the very first time. They're just so beautiful, as well as his poetry. But yes, those I think are all of the 25 books now that I wish I could experience for the first time. Again, I'd love to know if there's one book that you could choose to read for the very first time again, which would that book be and why? I'd love to know what springs to mind for you, because it really is a challenge. I could have mentioned so many more. I love the Northern Lights trilogy of books by Philip Pullman, for instance. I would have loved to have returned to those again. But I mean, yes, I could go on and I can't, but I'd love to hear what books that you would love to read again for the very first time. I hope you enjoyed these recommendations, and if you haven't read any of these before, then I can tell you you're definitely in for a treat. All of these are some of my very favourite books and poems of all time, so I so recommend them. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've had a wonderful weekend. I'll see you again very soon. Goodbye.